are at risk if we do not act quickly. Mitch McConnell stole a Supreme Court majority because he thought he could get away with it. And right now, it looks like he's right. I expect you will hear from the other side today about the risk of expanding the court. Those are important questions, and I look forward to addressing them. But the cost of inaction is a message to Republicans that they can cheat and steal without ever facing any consequences. Inaction already has allowed Republicans to expand their stolen majority to an illegitimate supermajority. And it's the Supreme Court that year after year is making it easier and easier for Donald Trump's Republican Party to entrench minority rule with voter suppression and partisan gerrymandering. There is no question the Supreme Court is working just fine for the people closest to it. The justices, the elite lawyers, and the law professors who win prestige by their proximity to the court. But in a democracy, the Supreme Court isn't supposed to work for a legal aristocracy. It's supposed to work for everyone. Far too often, when people like you and me say the Supreme Court is broken, the so-called experts, these lawyers, the law professors, the journalists, and even the justices themselves tell us to trust the system. So when the justices get decades-old protections for voters of color in the South, trust the system. When the justices kill a law that tries to keep billionaires from buying elections, trust the system, y'all. When time and time again they side with corporations over workers, trust the system. But here's the deal. The system I trust is democracy. And our Constitution sets up a clear way for the people's elected representatives in Congress to act to address this crisis by changing the number of seats on the Supreme Court as it has multiple times throughout history and to restore balance. So again, vote yes to expand the Supreme Court.
Thank you, Tamara Brummer. Our next speaker will be speaking against the motion. Akhil Reed-Amar, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. So the fundamental problem is not a constitutional problem. The number 9 doesn't appear in the document. We haven't always had 9 justices. And the size of the court has changed over the years for various reasons. So we could do it. But it would be a bad idea because when you change the size of the court for purely partisan advantage, then what goes around comes around. And when the other side comes in, it's going to try to add, you add 6, they add 12, then you add 18, and things spirals out of control. And that's just an obvious argument. I'm sure it's occurred to all of you. So how do we think about that? So first, let me introduce myself since my esteemed colleague talked about her background. I'm a Democrat. I fiercely opposed Donald Trump's election. I also don't think that the system can never be improved in any way. Some of you may have heard of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, a way of getting direct election of the presidency without a constitutional amendment. I'm the co-inventor of that. Some of you may be opposed to the filibuster. I'm actually the architect, the father of the so-called nuclear option. By the way, we Democrats did it first. Before Mitch McConnell did it, for the Supreme Court, we did it, and rightly so, for Court of Appeals judges. I do believe that the Supreme Court can be improved in its structure. An idea of justices serving basically on the front bench for 18 years and then doing a relaxed service thereafter, I think is actually the sweet spot of constitutional reform. I think it could actually get the support of Republicans and Democrats. It wouldn't unravel. I testified about this before the Biden Commission, and I think that's actually a much more realistic possibility than adding a lot of seats in a way that will cause the system to unravel. And actually, 18 years works particularly well with 9. So the argument on the other side is basically that desperate times call for desperate measures, but we're not in desperate times because it's actually not true. The Supreme Court is broken, illegitimate, basis of that there's been cheating and stealing going on. If there were, then maybe you should do something absolutely desperate. Although, keep aware, my friends, you can make the system worse rather than better. Change isn't always for the good, as anyone who saw 4 years of Donald Trump should recognize. I'm one of Merrick Garland's closer friends in the world. If you go to his office, you'll actually see copies of my book in his library, and both of his daughters were actually my students. I wanted him confirmed, but that wasn't stolen. We Democrats didn't control the Senate, and you need both the president and the Senate to get stuff through. And we thought we were going to win the presidency in 2016, and if we had, then Merrick Garland would have been confirmed. Mitch McConnell did modify the filibuster rules for Neil Gorsuch. That's because we Democrats did it first for the DC Circuit, and I'm glad we did. So don't believe, it's simply not true as a matter of constitutional law, that the system was rigged or stolen, that there was cheating going on, it's broken. And you could make it worse by doing this. I think you will. I think it would spiral out of control. And the one branch of government that is the least dysfunctional right now, less dysfunctional in the presidency, less dysfunctional in the House and Senate, is the judiciary, the Supreme Court. So don't mess it up, because you could break it and will break it if we spiral out of control, as I fear we would with this proposal, which is why almost no serious Democrat, truthfully, on the commission or in Congress, the mainstream Democrats are not supporting this measure.
I'm John Donvan. This is Intelligence to expand the Supreme Court. Here is Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia, the screen's yours.
Thank you so much, John, and to my esteemed co-panelists. This is like watching the Harlem Globetrotters, and it's just a thrill to be here. As I started to prep for this debate, it occurred to me that, in fact, the Supreme Court was doing the bulk of the work for me in the last couple of weeks. You've just heard my opponents suggest that we are not currently in desperate times. I just want to flag for those of you who are not watching the court TikTok the way we are, that just in the last few weeks, the court reinstated a very controversial Remain in Mexico policy, made constitutionally permissible abortion impossible to achieve for 90% of the pregnant people in Texas. All that was done on its shadow docket. The court's been happy on the shadow docket to set aside an eviction moratorium, happy on its shadow docket to change COVID restrictions. This is all being done unsigned. We don't quite know what the law is. And this is being done while Justices Barrett and Breyer are taking to the hustings. They're spending their time telling us how to think about the Supreme Court, instructing us, as Justice Barrett did just very recently, sitting next to Mitch McConnell, that justices are apolitical and we need to think about them that way. And by the way, slagging the press as she did so. This all feels to me like something of a crisis. And I guess I slightly push back on the notion we're not in desperate times. I think the court has done an immense amount of mischief in secret and silently, unexplained and unjustified. And at the same time are stomping around and telling us that we should treat them as though they're magic. So in my view, the case sort of made itself this summer. I could sit down now, but I just want to add two quick observations to those really trenchant points raised by my colleague. And the first is, and I think she flicked at this, but I want to say it really explicitly, the Supreme Court is, in essence, at this moment, a privilege machine. It is people with jurists who went largely to one of two law schools. They, all of them came up through a very narrow system of how they were selected and what their prior job experience was. Amazingly, it's staffed by law clerks who are deeply connected to prominent lawyers, professors, oral advocates, and the justices themselves. Everyone in the family is bound up with the family. And I want to just pause to say I have inordinate respect for the institution of the court. I've been covering it for 20 years. I have, as my colleague tweaked me slightly, had access to the justices, to the cocktail parties. I've seen the magic happen with all the jazz hands that comes with it. And I am here to tell you that despite my immense respect for the court, it is absolutely not the case that the court looks like or responds to the exigent lives of Americans today. And so I just want to echo my partner. It cannot be the case that the only people entitled to have strong opinions on this matter are the people who have a vested interest in preserving the status quo. The second point I want to make, and this is really essential, is that I believe that at this moment in time, the court is actually a democracy-breaking machine. That we have seen the rise of authoritarianism. We have seen the rise of Republican state legislatures arrogating power to themselves, arrogating now the power to set aside election results, to change the way we count ballots. So much of this has been blessed by the Supreme Court. So much of it, from Brnovich to Shelby County, has been explicitly permitted. And so when you ask yourselves whether you want to vote with us or vote with our opposition, I would just suggest that whether we are in desperate times is in the eye of the beholder. And in my eyes, what the court has wrought and is poised to wreak upon democracy itself is not something that can wait for commissions and long discursions by very smart people who may and may not be impacted by the consequences. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dahlia Lithwick. Our final opening statement comes from Carter Phillips. Carter, it's your turn.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it. It's wonderful to be on this panel. As I suppose one of those who's been privileged up to this point in my life, I will plead guilty to some fondness for how the court has operated in the past, and at least some sense that there is something to be said for a structure that has been in place since 1869. And therefore, obviously, it would take at least a pretty clear piece of evidence that that system is fundamentally broken. We're going to make a very significant change in how the court operates. And I don't dispute what either Dahlia or Tamara has said about the problems that have arisen with the court. Some decisions that people disagree with, some decisions, the shadow docket, the fact that Judge Garland did not end up on the Supreme Court. But those are not problems that are created by the number 9. Those are problems that are created because the Senate operated the way the Senate did. You can agree or disagree with it, but those rules apply across the board. The shadow docket is something that can be dealt with by Congress. It can force the court to go through a different procedure. It can limit the authority of the court to act in a particular way if it chooses to do so. It seems to me that the problems that you identify are not problems that necessarily get fixed by simply adding 4 new justices. I don't know what the argument is for doing that, other than you don't like particular decisions. The downside, of course, of changing it to 13 justices is, at least as a practical matter, that's a very fundamental change in the dynamic of how that institution would operate. It's never had that many individuals on the court. It is candidly difficult enough as somebody who once upon a time clerked at that court and knows what it takes to get to 5, and now you have to get to 7. And after you lose power in the next election and the Republicans come back and add 2 more to get to 9, you were talking about an extraordinarily complicated process. If we were sitting in a situation where the court was up against it in terms of being able to do the work, you might say, well, then let's bring in more bodies in order to achieve that. That's not the problem. The court's only deciding 70 cases this term compared to 155, 160, 40 years ago when I was clerking. And so there's no real argument for increasing the numbers. What there are arguments about are for fixing problems directly, if there are in fact problems. But adding 4 extra justices is not something that's going to move you in that direction. And so what I would urge the audience to realize is packing the court wasn't right in the 1930s. Packing the court is not right today. There are other solutions. I don't have any problem with term limits. I don't have any problem with other approaches to trying to rein in a court if people are concerned about it. You can even play with the court's jurisdiction to some extent. But I don't think the answer is ever going to be just adding more bodies, because that's a never-ending cycle. You can't stop that once you go down that path. Because you can't, at least without a constitutional amendment, you're not going to be able to start throwing bodies off that court, given that they have life tenure. So it's a one-way ratchet. It's not the right answer to this problem. You should vote no against the resolution.